So we can open the votes. Following the adoption of this morning's amendments, we've sent the voting results. We'll have the final vote on Madame Carvalho's, on Madame Carvalho's, on Mr. Matos, and on energy products. Now, I'm the rapporteur. I think it's the strategies on the Indo-Pacific. So the vote is open. You have to send in your bulletins filled out, assigned before 2:45. Europa, and send it to the European Parliament's email address. Now, the afternoon is split in two. The first half is the impact of the cooperation agreement, fascinating for some, between the United Kingdom and on fisheries and aquaculture. Now, we don't want to stop at the moment, so there's a workshop that we're going to split into three. First, on the legal aspects, second, on the trade aspects, and the third, on aspects dealing with the possibility of fishing possibilities. So 3 studies were produced on this. So I would now give the floor to the whoever wants to taking the floor on the first part. So we start with the legal aspects. The study was produced by the Rostock University by Professor Pols and Dr. Schatz from the law faculty. Professor Bruce, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I apologize, or correct me if I'm wrong. Anyway, you have 20 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I hope that you can understand me.
Yes, everything is clear.
Wonderful, and thank you very much for pronouncing my family name so perfectly. Now, honourable members of Parliament, it is a particular pleasure for me to present the first part of the presentations of today's workshop on the legal framework concerning the trade and cooperation agreement concluded between the EU and the United Kingdom. So thank you very much for giving me, also on behalf of Dr. Schatz, my colleague at the University of Hamburg, this opportunity to present our main findings. Next slide, please. Allow me to very briefly start with an overview on the structure of this presentation. I will first give an overview about the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which I will refer to with the abbreviation TCA in the following, then focusing on the most important parts of this agreement concerning fisheries, and that includes first the fishing opportunities, secondly access arrangements, maybe the most important part of the entire agreement text with regard to, fisheries management, then moving on to dispute resolution, make a few remarks afterwards on the special regime applicable to the Crown dependencies of the UK, and then moving on to the relationship between the fisheries-related provisions of the agreement and the more general trade-related provisions. And I will then end with a couple of general recommendations prior to the question and answer session. Next slide, please. Now, if I may start with the overview on the Trade and Cooperation Agreement as far as its fisheries-related provisions are concerned, then the first thing I would like to say is that this agreement, while certainly not only and exclusively a fisheries agreement, is at the same time a bilateral fisheries agreement. In contrast to many other fisheries agreements which have been concluded on the international level, the TCA is characterized by the strong integration of the fisheries-related provisions with regard to the trade-related provisions. They are incorporated in the very same part of the agreement, and as I will try to demonstrate in the following minutes, there is also a very close nexus between the two subject matters in terms of content. Now, the fact that this agreement has been concluded by the EU on the one hand and the UK on the other characterizes the agreement as an international treaty, meaning a treaty governed by public international law, at least not directly by European Union law. This is not to say that the provisions and mechanisms of the common fisheries policy do not have a word to say with regard to the trade and cooperation agreement, but as I will try to demonstrate in the following, this is only done in an indirect manner. In other words, unless the provisions of the trade and cooperation agreement do not specifically require otherwise, fisheries management and conservation are a matter of domestic law of the two parties to the treaty. And if I'm using the term domestic law here, I'm referring to the supranational law of the EU on the one hand, in particular, and namely the common fisheries policy, and the domestic fisheries law of the UK on the other. Now, the focus of the relevant provisions concerning fisheries of the TCA, which are codified in heading 5 of Part 2 of the agreement, focus on fishing opportunities, on access to fish stocks in the maritime zones of the respective other party, and on dispute resolution. One thing I would like to highlight already at this early stage is that the relevant provisions foresee an adjustment period, which is going to end on the 30th of June 2026. And after that point in time, the entire rules of the game, if I may use this colloquial term, will change quite dramatically, and I will move on to that at a later stage. Allow me to make a very few words on the institutional arrangements. Also, as far as fisheries is concerned, the Partnership Council, which was established by the TCA, has the dominating role to play with its far-reaching powers, including quasi-legislative competences, which, for example, would include the possibility to amend and supplement the trade and cooperation agreement. More specifically, as far as fisheries is concerned, the TCA envisages the establishment of a specialized committee on fisheries comprised of representatives of the two parties, which is the responsible body for the consultations which enjoy a dominating role in the overall regime concerning fisheries management established by this agreement. Now, we submit that overall the pertinent provisions concerning fisheries management may not be the best deal for the United Kingdom for reasons which I will explain and further elaborate in more detail in a second. Next slide, please. Allow me to then move on to the fishing opportunities. The regime of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is based, at least as far as the most important fish stocks are concerned, on the concept of annual consultations. These annual consultations have to be conducted in order to set what is called the total allowable catch per stock, but only per stock mentioned in Annex 35 of this agreement. And furthermore, these consultations will then include the allocation of predetermined quota shares for the two parties of the agreement. Now, Annex 35 refers and contains a list to what is called jointly managed stocks, which are fish stocks that can be found in the exclusive economic zone of both the European Union and the UK. Secondly, fishing opportunities include fixed quota shares with regard to trilaterally managed stocks, meaning stocks managed by the European Union, by the UK, and thirdly, by Norway, as well as with regard to so-called coastal state stocks, which are in particular those fish stocks that are managed within the framework of the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Organizations as well as other stocks managed by other regional fisheries management organizations. Now, in this respect, total allowable catches and allocations for these stocks concerned are not decided on the basis of annual consultations under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, but instead decided by the relevant coastal states in their entirety or within the frameworks of the competent regional management fisheries organizations. Now, altogether, with regard to both groups of stocks which I mentioned so far, the tables that have been attached to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement foresee a gradual reduction of quota shares allocated to the European Union until the end of the adjustment period on the 30th of June 2026, and then adherence to fixed quotas. In other words, what the parties have done is they have incorporated the principle of relative stability on which also the common fisheries policy is based. Now, what happens if the two parties cannot agree on joint total allowable catches with regard to the first category of stocks? In that instance, both sides are entitled to establish provisional total allowable catches. Now, this is interesting because how do you do that? What the agreement foresees is that these provisional total allowable catches need to be in line with the scientific advice that is mainly provided by the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea. So we have here an interesting example of a fisheries management agreement which allocates fundamental importance to fisheries science. One of the very few examples where this has happened, but let me emphasize that this only applies with regard to a binding relevance of the scientific advice with regard to provisional total allowable catches. Now, obviously, there is a certain challenge, a certain problem that includes the management regimes, which also include third states, be it Norway, be it other states, which cooperate with the EU and the UK within regional fisheries management bodies, taking into account that these states cannot be bound to the provisions of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement because obviously they are not parties to that agreement. So it will have to be seen whether these third states will adhere and follow the general structure and conception of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Next slide, please. I'll move on then to perhaps at least from the perspective of the two parties, the most important and most controversial issue, namely the issue of access arrangements. Now, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement provides for the adjustment period, which I mentioned before. And during this adjustment period, each of the two parties has full access to the exclusive economic zone of the other party, as well as partial access to the 6 to 12 nautical miles belt of the territorial seas of the parties. Now, this, as far as the territorial sea is concerned, only applies, however, to what is called qualifying vessels, which are vessels that have fished in the areas concerned already prior to the entry into force of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. In case the two parties did not manage to agree on total allowable catches, but have instead established provisional total allowable catches on the basis of what I mentioned before, there is an obligation under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement to provide for provisional access. Now, depending on which stock is concerned, the two parties still need to try to agree on final total allowable catches for the year concerned. And the Trade and Cooperation Agreement foresees certain time limits within which this has to be done. Now, if no such agreement can be achieved by the two parties, the parties may unilaterally change the level and conditions of provisional access to the detriment of the other party. In that case, meaning if either the EU or the UK makes use of this option, the other party to the agreement may take what is called compensatory measures in response. Such measures would include the possibility to suspend access by itself and or suspend preferential tariff treatment granted to fishery products. In case such a dispute arises because the other party argues that such compensatory manage is disproportional, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement foresees binding dispute resolution by an arbitral tribunal. But as you can see, particularly as far as provisional access is concerned, there is a certain potential for disputes between the states parties. Now, what happens after the end of the adjustment period, meaning starting from 1st of July 2026, again, annual consultations will have to be conducted with the aim to determine the level and conditions of access for at least some of the stocks mentioned in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. However, this is only to be regarded as an obligation of conduct, not of result. In other words, there is no guarantee that after the end of the adjustment period, the two parties will grant to fishermen of each other the possibility to have access to the fish stocks within their zones. Next slide, please. Let me then make a couple of remarks concerning dispute resolution, and this leads me to the arrangements of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement on governance. If one of the two parties allegedly violates the provisions of Heading 5 containing the regime of fisheries, the agreement foresees a mechanism for remedial measures. And such remedial measures would, for example, include the suspension of fisheries access, again, the suspension of preferential tariff treatment for fisheries products and other goods, again, and ultimately, even the suspension of entire Part 2 of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Now, this mechanism is obviously based on escalatory steps and the principle of proportionality. And as you can easily imagine, if one state takes remedial measures, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement foresees the possibility that it's not the possibility, it's actually a mandatory duty that these remedial measures are brought to judicial review by an arbitral tribunal in order for that tribunal to assess whether the measures concerned are proportionate or not. Should then the arbitral tribunal finds that the remedial measures were unlawful, the respondent party, either the EU or the UK, can ask the arbitral tribunal to determine proportionate countermeasures. So here in this system, there is clearly a basis for potential disputes in the future. At the same time, and this is important, this special dispute resolution mechanism foreseen with regard to the fisheries-related provisions is not the only one which recourse can be made to, but rather the Trade and Cooperation Agreement foresees a general dispute resolution mechanism which is based on a different conception, namely arbitration first and remedial measures second. And it is fair to say that this general dispute resolution is perhaps the milder means, the more proportional mechanism compared to the one which was included in the Heading 5 on fisheries. Next slide, please. A few remarks on the Crown dependencies, which refers to the bailiwicks of Guernsey, Jersey, and the Isle of Man, a matter which, as you know, has already created controversies in the past. Now, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement foresees special access arrangements for such vessels, but not for all of them, but rather only for what is called again qualifying vessels, which are vessels that used to do fishing in the zones concerned of the other party in the past, and they did so on the basis of an international legal arrangement. And to this day today, there is only one such arrangement in force that used to be in force when the TCA was concluded, and that is the Granville Bay Agreement concluded between France and the United Kingdom. The specific measures concerning the Crown dependency also foresee different remedial measures, and they also see the possibility to separately terminate the specific provisions on access within the waters around the bailiwicks of Guernsey, Jersey, and Isle of Man. If this mechanism would be activated, this would result in a reactivation of the former Granville Bay Agreement. Now, what kind of waters, I haven't mentioned this so far, are covered by these specific rules? These specific rules are referred to the territorial seas around the bailiwicks of Guernsey, Jersey, and the Isle of Man in particular, and exclusively at a distance between 6 and 12 nautical miles. Next slide, please. A few words on the integration of fisheries and trade. Now, I mentioned before that heading 5, containing all the fisheries-related provisions, has been included into the general provisions and the general part on trade. We would argue that this was a big success, negotiating success for the European Union, because the United Kingdom had a strong interest to try to negotiate a separate, purely fisheries-related bilateral agreement. Now, should, as an ultima ratio remedial measure, the fisheries provisions be terminated by one of the two parties, this would indeed lead to the termination of the entire Part 2 on trade, a measure which would be to the great disadvantage for both parties, of course, but I would argue in particular for the United Kingdom. The sole exception which exists is the situation of the Crown dependencies as mentioned before. So what the parties have effectively done is they have locked into heading 5 on fisheries into the overall regime, meaning if one of the parties decides to terminate the fisheries-related parts, they are willing to risk the entire trade relationship as a whole, and I find it difficult to imagine that this is happening. Last slide, please. Allow me then to finish with my general recommendations. In light of the potential for disputes between the two parties, which I try to highlight, it is of utmost importance that the trade and cooperation agreement is implemented in good faith, that the mutual expectations are properly managed, and that both sides take moderate positions. What I have not mentioned so far is that the trade and cooperation agreement also contains sophisticated conservation principles, and taking into account the crisis of overfishing that exists globally, but also regionally, it is of utmost importance that the principles, which actually reflect state-of-the-art of international fisheries law, are properly implemented. In other words, it is important that the matter of sustainability of fisheries management is prioritized over potentially controversial access and fishing opportunities matters. Trade-related instruments should only be used as last resort, and as I try to highlight, the general dispute resolution mechanism is generally the preferable option to be used in case of alleged violations of the agreement, because it is less intrusive and escalatory in comparison to the specific dispute settlement regime established by heading 5. And with that, I would like to thank you for your kind attention. Happy to answer questions which may have arisen. Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know whether we should take questions one at a time, or should we first go through the 3 presentations and then have general questions? We'll do the 3 and then have the questions at the end. So we're going to hear our other speakers, and then that way you can share out the questions on the basis of the issues. Thank you very much, Professor Preuss, for your presentation. Very enlightening. And I mean, whetted our appetite. Actually, we've just eaten, but anyway, looking forward to getting back to you with questions. So on we press to the second presentation. Here we're talking about the trade-related aspects. So research has been done by Dr. Helene Bartelings and Dr. Susanna Smets-Kristkova. Hope I got the pronunciation right. Two researchers from the Wageningen Economic Research of the University of the same name in the Netherlands. Ms. Bartelings, I trust you're online. You two have 20 minutes to outline your findings, please. The floor is yours, madam.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you and see you. That's nice.
Yes.
Fine.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Helene Bartelings from Wageningen Economic Research, and I will present this afternoon the second research paper, which looks specifically at the trade impacts of the EU-UK trade agreements. Like I said before already, I did this research together with my colleague Susanna Smets-Kristkova, who is also present here this afternoon. Next slide, please. First, very shortly, the structure of today's presentation. I will first go in a short introduction and a methodological approach. Then I will go shortly into the description of how we implemented the TCA agreement into our model. And then I will show the results of our scenario analysis and show our calculated economic impact of the trade agreements. And finally, we have some conclusions and recommendations. Next slide, please. First, the objective. So in this study, we wanted to investigate the potential trade and economic impacts of the TCA on fisheries and aquaculture in the EU. To calculate this, we used a computable general equilibrium model called MAGNET. MAGNET is a model that describes the entire economy and the entire world, and therefore it is able to capture the interconnection of fisheries and aquaculture with other actors in an open economy. Our model is built in our institute, Wageningen Economic Research, and it's based on a well-known US model called GTAP. And we have used as a starting point a model and data from the GTAP model, but then adjusted this in various projects to the needs of our research projects. And among others, our model is used by the European Commission and in the OECD. And in a Horizon 2020 project called Success, we have actually implemented the fisheries and aquaculture module that was used also in this project. Next slide. To analyze the economic impact of the TCA on a macro level, we have run two scenarios. First, we have run a baseline scenario where we simulate the economy up till 2025 without a trade agreement. So it's a sort of business as usual and there are no trade distortions. Then we also run a TCA scenario where we implement the measures of the TCA and then compare the two scenarios, and the difference is then the impact of the implementation of the TCA. To implement the TCA, we have we did several shocks to the model. So first of all, we looked at the fish access. Since the UK EEZ is partly closed for European fisheries, we have included this in our model by adjusting the quota. And we based this on a literature study, how much the quota should be reduced. And the biggest impact here is what you see to pelagic fishes, where we see that in Ireland 18% less can be fished, and in Belgium, Netherlands 13%. In contrast, the UK gets more quota because they have more access to their own stocks. Apart from the fish access, we also looked at non-tariff trade measures and trade facilitation costs. And again, based on a literature study, we implemented non-tariff trade measures varying from 3 to 20% extra costs, depending on the product, and trade facilitation costs, which increased by 5%. Next slide, please. First of all, to understand the results of our analysis, it's also very important to understand the starting point of the trade between the UK and the EU on fish products. And here I'm using the term fish products for all fish products in the economy, and that in our model is aquaculture products, wild fish products, and products from the fish processing industry. And what we see is that overall, at the start, the UK is more dependent on the EU than vice versa for its fish-related products. So in the starting point, we see that the EU gets about 60% of its imports and about 9% of its exports from the UK. And the UK gets 27% of its imports, and almost 68% of its exports go to the EU. So the interdependency of the UK on the EU is far more in trade-related matters. So the impact of the TCA will also be bigger on the UK. Next slide, please. And then here we see how the trade will change after the introduction from the TCA. And what you can notice in this graph is that both the EU and the UK trade less with each other, and therefore the balance of trade in fish products declines for these two regions. If the trade declines between two regions, that will also mean that other regions get an advantage. And that's something that you also saw, that so Norway, the China and the rest of Asia will trade more with the UK and the EU. And therefore they benefit actually from the introduction of the TCA. Next slide, please. The previous graph was for the entire EU, but the impact on different EU member states is quite different from the total. And especially for wild fisheries, we see that some countries will benefit from the TCA, and some of the EU member states will lose some of their trade due to the TCA. And this is mainly because for wild fisheries we have the fish access, and any country that is impacted by the reduced fish access loses some of the advantages in the trade of fish products. However, other countries like Spain and the rest of the EU don't fish in the UK EEZ yet, or didn't fish there, and therefore their sector is not affected, and this gives them a comparative advantage on the trade in fish products, and we see that they can take over part of the trade from the UK to the EU, and therefore they have an advantage on their trade balance. For processed fish, the trade impact is negative for all EU member states, and this is really an impact of non-trade measures. So this processed fish sector is quite dependent on trade. They import a lot of fish to process, and then the processed fish gets exported. So they are hurt twice by the trade distortions of the TCA. Next slide, please. If you then look at the production impact, you see a similar pattern as the trade impact. We see that overall the production of fish-related products in the EU declines slightly by about 1%. And fish processing is really the main driver for this. We see quite a reduction in the volume of fish processing. about 11% in Ireland, and 6% in Sweden and the Netherlands, which are the EU member states that have the highest impact. The impact of the fish excess is also present, and some of the countries do have a reduction in the volume of wild fish production. However, this is less than the impact of the non-trade tariff measures. In our analysis, we saw that the non-trade tariff measures cause about a loss of $130 million for the entire EU, and the reduced access costs about $40 million in production volume. Next slide, please. The reduced production, the reduced trade, the extra cost of trade all have an impact also on the consumption of fish products. And what we see here is that due to the more expensive fish, because they need to be imported with trade distortions, and consumers eat a lot of imported fish in the EU, we see that the price for fish consumption increases, and therefore the volume of consumption will decline. What we also see is that this impact is the biggest in Ireland, and this really stands out. What also will happen, especially in Ireland, is that because of the higher cost of imported fish, consumers will try to switch more to domestic fish, and this is shown in the graph below. And they will try to consume more of the cheaper domestic fish compared to the more expensive imported fish. So there is some substitution going on. And next slide, please. While it was not the main focus of our study, we also wanted to have a short look at the societal impacts of the TCA. And this can be done with sustainable development goals. In Magnet, we have calculated several sustainable development goal indicators, and here we show a selected set of these indicators. And what can be found is that the impacts on the UK are more pronounced than on the EU. The UK economy, in terms of GDP per capita and disposable income, will shrink by more than 2% compared to the baseline, whereas for the EU the decline is only 1%. Another visible impact is found in the case of trade openness, which would reduce by 2% in the UK, but the EU is hardly affected in its trade openness. The trade openness also has some advantages actually for the UK, because it protects its domestic agricultural production. And what we see is that an increased share in agricultural employment and production value in the UK has a positive impact, which also results in a higher caloric supply. Next slide, please. Then in the end, I here want to have a complete overview of the different impacts that we saw in our model due to the introduction of the TCA. And I've split this out by EU member state and the different fish products, aquaculture products, processed fish products and wild fish products. And we show the impact on production, consumption, import and export. In general, you see in this graph that the impact is mostly negative for both the EU and the UK. Especially fish processing overall shows a very negative impact. There are also some positive trade-offs in the export of aquaculture and in the exports of wild fish. And this is because the UK faces a loss in the export markets, and some European countries like Belgium, Denmark and Germany can take advantage of this. So there are also some small positive impacts on the trade within the EU. these developments, especially the positive trade-offs in trade, are further transmitted to third countries. And we see in this graph that Norway, Iceland, and the rest of Europe also benefit from the TCA because of the losses trade between the EU and the UK. Next slide, please. And then finally, some conclusions and recommendations of our study. The TCA is a lose-lose situation where both the UK and the EU will suffer from reduced trade, production and consumption. The impacts are, however, fairly limited, especially for the EU. As the UK is more dependent on its trade with the EU than vice versa, the impact for the UK will be more pronounced than the impact for the EU. On member state levels, Ireland will be the most impacted. The fish processing is impacted the most of the fish-related sectors, and it may be worthwhile to analyze how the impact of this sector can be minimized, especially given that the current policies are more targeted to wild fisheries and not so much to the fish processing, which also can expect quite a bit of an impact. What I do want to stress in the end is that while our study shows that on an aggregated macroeconomic level, the impact on the EU is there, but it is limited. We did not look at results on company level. So especially companies that are dependent on the UK AEZ will have more impact than what we see on an aggregated national level. So it would be worthwhile to have a case study which also investigates this in detail on a company level. This is what I wanted to present today of our study. I would like to thank you for your attention.
Merci, Madame Barthelings, pour cette présentation.
Thank you for that presentation, Ms. Barthelings. That gave us a really good overview of the context. Questions will be after the final presentation. So we're going to hear the third presentation. Thank you, by the way, for having stuck with the time limit. Now, the third part is about fishing opportunities aspects. And I know the place these people are from. So Mr. Benoit Gaillard, based in Brest, and Mr. Pavel Saltz too. So Mr. Gaillard, I hand over to you for 20 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Donc, les présentations sont faites.
Thank you. I represent a French think tank in Brest, and we focus on fisheries there. And I have drafted this with Pavel Saltz, who's in the Netherlands. Next slide, please. Today's presentation will be split into 6 parts. First, the TCA, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and an analytical approach which guided us as we looked at fishing opportunities. Then the second part will be the context. What is the role of these so-called shared fish stocks? Third point will be the impact of reduced fishing opportunities for the EU. The fourth point will be about the BAR, the Brexit Adjustment Reserve. This, of course, is a financial mechanism or instrument that was adopted by the EU in order to soften the blow of Brexit on the member states, particularly as regards fisheries. Then the fifth point, we'll look at 2 specific case studies that we've carried out. We did that because we wanted to see what was happening on the ground. We wanted to see what the real fallout of Brexit was. So one of the case studies is in the Netherlands, the other in France. Then the final part of the presentation will be the conclusions and the recommendations. Next slide, please. So it has already been spoken about. The first presentation mentioned this. The TCA covers 105 stocks, and they are fished in the EU 27 and the UK's waters. However, the TCA doesn't cover all international stocks. I'm thinking about those stocks that we share with Norway and the Faroe Islands. Those stocks are covered via a different forum. So this TCA establishes a gradual transfer of fishing opportunities from the EU 27 to the UK, covering the 2021 to 2025 period. Another important point on fisheries opportunities is the following. If you're going to make the most of fishing opportunities, you need to have access to waters. So the TCA establishes the access conditions for vessels in the respective EEZs. So this is the 6 to 12 mile zone and the waters that are adjacent to the waters adjacent to Jersey and Guernsey. Next slide, please. So we employed an analytical approach. We carried out simulations, simulating the impact of transfer of quota as established under the TCA, and we compared that to the 2019 situation. We supposed that everything else, all other criteria, would be the same. We'll talk about that later, though. In our simulation, we took into account the quota swaps which took place, which had already taken place between the member states. So at that time, the UK was a member state. So we looked at the role of quota swaps between EU 27 and UK, and the use of tax are accounted for. So if we look at the initial results, we do see what the consequences of the TCA are. Just to point out that these aren't forecasts, because what we saw quite quickly was that stocks could also vary. They could go up in relation to quotas. So if stocks were good, quotas could go up. Of course, if stocks were poor, quotas would go down. So there were quota variations due to conservation imperatives. So the variation of stocks was had a greater impact than the role of the quota swaps. Next slide. Now if we look at the context and the role of shared stocks, here you have various figures which are important. If we look at total EU 27 catches, so we're talking about the Northwest Atlantic, Mediterranean, and for other external waters. So in 2019, the quantity stood at 3.7 million tons, and the value of that was 6.3 billion euros. If we go down, what you see relates to catches under cooperation agreements. Catches under cooperation agreements stand at 1.3 million tons with a value of 1.6 billion euros. So catches covered by tax are 50% of volumes and around 45% of value. So this is really significant. So what we see is that the TCA is essential for European vessels. It's essential if European vessels are going to continue their activities. Next slide. We also carried out a detailed analysis of the impact of quota transfers or quota swaps under the TCA. We looked at this, we broke it down by species and by member state. So on the left you see by species, and it is done by tonnage. So the most impacted species will be pelagic species, including mackerel, herring, and Norway pout. Then on the bottom at the left, you see mackerel, and mackerel will be the fish whose value is most impacted. And that will also be I will also see an impact on demersal species, including cod, anglefish, hake, and others. So we've broken this down by quantity and by value, but there's a difference. Of course, the pelagic species are species whose unit cost per ton is low. And sole, cod, and others have a much higher unit cost. Then, if we look at the right, we see which member states are most affected. The member states that are most affected by the decrease in fishing opportunities are the following: Denmark, Ireland, the Netherlands, France, and Germany. Why are they most affected? When you carry out the same simulation of value, we see that the same member states are affected. However, the level of variation is much greater. This is perhaps due to the specific characteristics of each member state and their activities in the UK's waters. So if we take a look at France, France is catching demersal species with a high trade value, and France suffers great losses. Ireland too, the Netherlands too, Denmark and Spain too. So you can see all of those countries illustrated on the graph. Next slide, please. We also carried out an examination of the real impact of reduced quotas under the TCA. Let me explain myself a bit more. The quotas which the member states have are used in a variable manner. Some quotas are fully used every year. So the quota or TAC represents a limit for them. So in the first column, we call them level 1. So the level of use, the take-up level of the TAC is over 90%, or up to 90%. Then we have a level 2. The take-up of the TAC is between 75 and 90% of possible fishing use. Then we have level 3, where the TAC is not fully used if you compare it to the maximum level. So this is level 3 for species, and here the TAC take-up is usually under 75% on an annual basis. Here we could see that the impact of the TCA mostly affects TACs where the take-up is high. So we're talking about 90%, around that figure. Then on the other hand, the reduced quotas won't affect the level 3 species as much. So these are TACs where the take-up is lower. At the end of the day, if you add it all up, and if you add up the red, That's the sum of the tax where the TCA establishes real restrictions and limits for the European fishing fleet, because these are tax that have very high take-up. So the red boxes, we think the real impact will be around 56 million tonnes per year, 56,000 tonnes per year, and value of euro 50.3 million. Next slide, please. Just a few words now about the BAR, the Brexit Readjustment Reserve. The BAR is the European Commission's tool from December 2020. It was formally adopted by the EU, by the co-legislators, in October 2021. This financial mechanism helps the member states which are suffering economic losses because of Brexit. So they have budgetary funds available in order to offset the losses caused by Brexit. The BAR funds have been dispersed already. A first round of money was dispersed based on the losses incurred by the member states because they had fewer fishing possibilities. So the main players, those who are mainly impacted, are the Netherlands, Ireland, France, Germany, Belgium and Denmark. If we look at the budget available, the BAR provides funding based on the coastal communities who depend on fishing. So that's on the right. So the BAR provides 62 million euros to coastal communities in the Netherlands, 56 million in Ireland, 51.5 million in France, and so on and so forth. Why are there relatively few member states who have used the possibilities afforded by the BAR? Well, back in September 2021, when we wrote our study, only France and Germany had really set up national implementing mechanisms to spend the money from the BAR. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at the case study for the Netherlands, if we look at the Dutch demersal fleet, it is heavily dependent on access to the UK's EEZ. However, the TCA's impact will be relatively limited in the short term. That's because the quota of the two main species, plaice and sole, have not been fully taken up in recent years. This means that the decrease in quota afforded to the Netherlands will be absorbable. The Dutch fleet can absorb it. However, if we look at the pelagic fleet, it's a different kettle of fish, so to speak. So the Dutch pelagic fleet operates mostly outside the UK EEZ, but the pelagic quota are fully utilised. This, in the short term, will affect the fleet, and it could lead to a loss of turnover of about 9.4 million euros in 2021, and then that loss will even increase. It will be a further 3.6 million euros by 2025. Next slide, please. Now, if we look at France, the situation is as follows. French fishing activities in UK waters amount to about 25% in tonnage terms and 18% in value terms. And here we're talking about the North East Atlantic. Analyses and consultations have been carried out with professional professional organisations. And we understand that the nominal cuts under the TCA amount to around 6,000 tonnes based on 2019 TAC levels. So these quota cuts or quota transfers are significant but manageable. However, what we've already seen in 2021 is that stocks vary. Stocks vary due to conservation reasons. And that variation has a bigger impact on fishing opportunities. If we look at what's happening with one fishing species, it's suffered a variation of 34%, and that's of course had a major impact. Haddock we're talking about here. And we've also seen that other species have had a 5% cut in their TAC because of conservation reasons. So some of these species are already at some risk, and the TCA has then further reduced the fishing opportunities for the French fishing fleet. Now, France, as I was saying earlier, is one of the 2 member states that has managed to establish compensation schemes linked to Brexit. So the first compensation mechanism or scheme compensates loss of turnover. It's called the IPCA, so the compensatory mechanism for loss of turnover. Then there's a second compensation scheme which helps with vessels that have been temporarily taken out of circulation. France and the French authorities are looking at establishing a third compensation scheme. This third compensation scheme would be for vessels that are permanently taken out of circulation. Next slide, please.
En conclusion, donc les pêches européennes vont donc.
Okay, so European fisheries are following the level of transfer established for the TCA. The TAC, there'll be a drop of 3 million ton, 1.3 million tons for a loss of about 108 million, which for the quota shared with the UK. Now, if you compare it with the situation in 2019, there'll be a reduction of 66,400 tons, which will lead to a reduction of 110,900 tons in 2025. The effect directs mainly to the small pelagics, as the quotas are usually fully used, with the impact of the TCA, which should be manageable on the performance of the fleets which use the fishing stocks, fishing allowable catches for the demersal stocks, which are not usually fully utilized. Next slide. So, in conclusion, the recommendations which were developed following a consultation and analysis for the fishing sectors, professional fisheries in Europe. There's a demand for the professional fisheries sector to be integrated or involved in the consultations between the EU and the UK on the fishing possibilities and how to use these possibilities. At the moment, the mechanism that has been set up through the is not too clear on how the consultative committees or the advisory councils will be able to interact with the negotiators. because we want to request for the European Fisheries to take part in the consultations and give their opinion. Then the second recommendation is that following the consultations we've had, the need to define more clearly the idea of a replacement vessel has to be defined. Basically, a new vessel, which would be bought by a ship owner to use the fisheries possibilities in the 6-12 mile zone of the United Kingdom. At the moment, though, there's no operational definition of this type of replacement vessel, and they request this to be a point that the specialised committee to deal with. Then there's another request that the trade and cooperation agreement should have access conditions for vessels to go to certain waters, but there's no possibility, or they haven't covered the possibility of the replacement vessel to be involved. So vessels who have historically had access to the Jersey and Guernsey waters in the past, with, on the other hand, once they leave the fleet for whatever reason, there's no possibility for the ship owner to apply for access to these waters for his new replacement vessel. So this is something else that the trade would like to have discussed by the Specialised Fisheries Committee. And the final recommendation is we've seen only 2 member states, France and Germany, have set up compensation plans for the use of the reserve caused by Brexit. And the recommendation is to encourage more member states to develop compatible systems so that the fisheries sector should be able to benefit from a compensation which was adopted in October 2021 at an EU level. I'd like to thank you, and I'm here available for any questions. Thank you, Mr. Taillard, for your presentation. So we've gone through all 3 presentations at this point, legal, trade, and fishing possibilities aspect, which has given us a general overview of the consequences. So, of course, if there are any questions on this point, and I'll leave the floor to my colleagues here. So I'm looking to see whether anyone in the meeting room has something to add. Or is there anybody online who wants to ask questions? Madame Rose has the floor. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank the 3 speakers for these really interesting reports. Now, the first point on legal acts. As you know, in the Fisheries Committee, we've talked about the fisheries license. The agreement establishes the criteria for the licenses, but the UK has established by itself the type of data one can put in for the they've complicated things for vessels that are smaller than 12 meters because and the European Commission has started negotiations when the UK changed these criteria. Do you think that it's the Commission should have opened these negotiations? Then there's another point on the legal aspect. There's a lot of uncertainty as to what will happen after 26. Now, I don't know whether I misunderstood, but you said, or you mentioned, that it's the principle of relative stability which should be applied for the quotas. But elsewhere, and you repeated it, you said that access to the waters will be the object of yearly negotiations. So Could you explain a bit more about this? Which conditions will we have to renegotiate the after 26, a yearly negotiation giving more visibility to the fisher folks would be a good idea. And can we improve the cooperation agreement? And is all this possible? Then the third point, access to fishing possibilities. Now, you mentioned the consequences in France. Could you give us more details on the type of fleets that have felt this impact in France? Another point, can you confirm that the drop of quotas has allowed for the coastal areas which did not necessarily fish in UK waters have seen the possibility now? What is the type of possibilities are there? Who is more concerned by the cessation of activities? And in general, do you have any information of states organized producers who've decided to have differentiated differences in fishing effort? For instance, is it possible to look at the points opened by Article 17 so you can limit the impact? And do you have any information on states already working on this? And then I note that in what you said, the development of the TCAs, could they compensate or increase the reductions that we've seen that are covered in the agreements? And is there any way to compensate the effects of Brexit on our fleets? So thank you. Thank you, Madam Rosa. Lambert has the floor.
Dank u wel, voorzitter. En ook dank aan de inleiders voor hun uitstekende presentaties. Echt heel goed.
Thank you for this excellent presentation. We've had a general overview of the consequences of the Brexit agreement from different points of view. The second speaker has pointed out that we were in a situation where everybody was losing because on both sides, both partners are going to lose. The EU will have a lot of bad impact, and the UK too. This is true, and we'll just have to deal with it. I would like to insist on the importance of access to these areas for the fisheries. It's true that we've discussed a lot on this. It seemed to regulate things in the short term, but what about the long term? I have the feeling that our possibilities really depend on access to the British waters. I would also like to go back to the last recommendation from the third speaker. You invite the member states to use the funds from the Brexit Adjustment Reserve. Now, I have the feeling here that only two countries, seen that only two countries have chosen this solution. I'm a bit shocked. What about the other member states? But a real question now, more specific question. Do you have an idea of why some member states are so slow in having these sums for the adjustment to Brexit, whilst in other member states they've been using them? Because I really think that it's very important, also given the increase of the fuel prices too. Thank you. Any other requests for the floor by the colleagues who are online? Grace O'Sullivan, Madam O'Sullivan, you have the floor from the Greens Island.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to those who have presented very well to us this afternoon. I have a number of questions, and my first one is to Alexander, and that is, during the adjustment period of the TCA, each party has full access, as you said, to the EEZ of the other party, as well as partial access to the 6 to 12 nautical mile zone for certain stocks. And after 2026, the 1st of July, consultations will determine the level and conditions of future access. So my question is, do you think this will have an impact on discussions, also on levels of access between the EU member states regarding inshore waters? So, for example, Ireland allows access to the 6 to 12 mile nautical mile zone to other member states, but no member state now allows similar access to Irish vessels. So now, with the impact of Brexit on Irish fisheries in particular, there may be an argument to strictly limit that access, not just to the UK, but to member states also. I just want to ask your opinion on that. Is there a legal possibility for a member state to end this access to the 6 to 12 nautical mile zone, or even to push the zone further out on a country-to-country basis? And then I have a question to Helene, and that is Ireland has lost out more than any other member state when it comes to the seafood trade, as you indicated, along with other species or aspects of Brexit. And with the decline in processing production of up to 12%, many of my constituents here in the south of Ireland have been cut off from their biggest market, and that was before the impacts of COVID hit. So is there any evidence that the UK has improved its own processing industry as a result? And in short, have there been any so-called Brexit benefits for UK fisheries and trade? And then my final question to Benoit is, the biggest impact on fishing opportunities in Ireland has been to the mackerel fleet, who previously have spent a lot of time in Scottish waters, and this stock has now been further affected by Norway's unilateral action. And in Ireland, this concerns about 50 larger Irish vessels, which account for 95% of Ireland's mackerel quota. And does the impact of Brexit on this fisheries give an impetus to member states to rebalance their fleets and fishing opportunities? So, for example, assigning larger quotas to inshore vessels or hook and line mackerel fleets, because the underutilisation of Article 17 of the CFP is an issue the Green Group have been very active on recently. And does Brexit provide an opportunity to provide for more fairness and equity for small-scale fishers? Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the presentations.
Merci, Grace.
Thank you, Grace. Any other requests for the floor online? Any members looking for the floor? I have some additional questions. You may not have a ready answer, but if you have an opinion, I'd be glad to hear it. Now, if I've got it right, as of this year, the proposals from the Commission for the negotiations on the tax with the UK are going to be included in the fishing opportunities in the North Atlantic regulation adopted by Council. So there's going to be a single overall series of negotiations on that regulation. How do you react to that? Do you think that's good news, or do you think it's compatible with the treaty? Second point, on governance and how that's evolving. And there, too, you might not have any hard and fast opinion because the treaty is a treaty, but we came up with an own initiative report not that long ago, and we highlighted the fact, and Stephanie de Courtin, facing the Anglo-Norman islands, is worried about how things are going to turn out. So governance when it comes to the Crown dependencies, things have really been re-centralized. So there's discussions between where there used to be discussions, but more on a local basis, whereas now it's all centralized. It's in London, it's in Brussels, and local issues shouldn't really necessarily be sorted out in DG Mare's offices. I'm not saying they do a bad job. I'm just saying it's so far afield that it doesn't make it any easier. I'd like to come back to the question from Caroline Rose. And I think really we need more clarity about the post-2026 era. I say that because everywhere I go, when I go in the fishing ports, the people have loads of questions, and you hear all kinds of things, and often the opposite of what you hear. And you said after the 2026, the allocations they're going to remain stable. So there's not going to be any renegotiation. Can you confirm that when it comes to these allocations, there's not going to be any renegotiations in 2026? That's very important for the fishers. We need clarity. It means no renegotiations. And for how long? Will there not be any renegotiations of these of these quotas? I think it's extremely important because the fisheries sector needs the stability. And then to finish on the comment by Member Royson on utilization and the low utilization of the Brexit Adjustment Reserve. And also sometimes here in our Fisheries Committee, the idea that when it comes to Brexit, we could use the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund, or the one that covers the agriculture as well. So we could use a structural fund to address what is a short-term economic problem. I'm not sure that that's a good idea to use the EMFF, excuse me. So I don't know if you've looked into this, but in the countries that didn't have recourse to the Brexit Adjustment Reserve, did they have recourse to the EMFF? Or just if you could touch on that. So I'm going to give you the floor. What I suggested is I give you the floor in the same order that you had it initially. Let me see if I can figure this out. Here we go. I've got it. Mr. Pulse, I wanted to get your name right. Professor Pulse, you have the floor. And we've got ample time. So if you want to take 10 minutes to give us your answers and opinions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all members of Parliament for these challenging questions. So let me take a look at my notes, which I've taken while you were asking your questions. First, Ms. Roos, the question concerning what happens after the end of the adjustment period, there's two different things to be kept apart from each other. And the first one is access. And indeed, following the end of the adjustment period, access needs to be renegotiated on a yearly basis. And that also includes then the establishment of the total allowable catch for the areas concerned, provided that access is granted. What remains stable is simply on the basis of the tables which have been attached to the TCA, the allocation of fishing opportunities, meaning the quotas between the two parties to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So once again, access needs to be renegotiated. The TCA, however, foresees a relative stability in relation to quota shares of the two parties, provided that, however, agreement concerning total allowable catch will be possible. Now, this is closely also related to one of the questions of you, Mr. Chairman. It's correct that there is an inherent element of legal uncertainty involved in the matter. And as we all know, time passes quickly. And it is also correct that the specific sector that is concerned by the provisions depends on legal certainty. But that requires renegotiation of the terms of the agreement. So as of today, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is based on the notion which I just tried to implement, even though I agree that it is somewhat what is the appropriate term? Uncomfortable, perhaps, because of the lack of legal certainty. So that will be my answer to that. Let me just briefly check and go through my notes again. Is it possible then, Ms. Roos, for the UK to adopt implementing legislation with regard to certain types of vessels? Yes, that's possible. It's in principle. It's possible both with regard to the EEZ, with regard to which the fishing vessels of each of the two parties need to apply the fisheries regulations of the respective party, but this also applies with regard to the territorial sea areas around the bailiwicks of Guernsey, Jersey, and the Isle of Man. However, this needs to be done in good faith and in a spirit of cooperation. Now, this sounds comparatively vague. That's certainly true, but if certain implementing measures and their application to the vessels of the other party lead to a situation where de facto access is not possible anymore, then this would be an abuse of rights. I would call this under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and could be challenged as a violation of the agreement. Let me turn then to the question of Ms. O'Sullivan. Theoretically, it would be possible to also change the framework with regard to the relationship between the member states of the EU, but this is a matter that is governed by the CFP regulation, and any change concerning access to the 6 to 12 nautical miles areas would require an amendment to Annex 1 of this European regulation. The matter is not governed by the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, but rather by the fundamental legislative act of the Common Fisheries Policy, which indeed would have to be amended if that either reserving certain areas or opening the reserved areas to the vessels flying the flag of other member states. So that would indeed require legislative activity to be taken. Just 1 second, please. Ms. Roos, you also asked on certain types of fleets and the effects on specific types of fleets. I have to say that I have no information on the matter. It was also not covered by what we were asked to do, so I'm unfortunately not in the position to give you a more specific reply on that question. What else did we have? Mr. Chairman, the Fishing Opportunities Regulation, would it be possible to include the opportunities of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement into that regulation? I haven't thought about this, I have to say. I do not see any legal reason why it should not be possible. Whether or not it makes sense is a political question. I think I'm lacking a more specific answer here too. And once again, your question concerning renegotiations, yes, of course that's true. And negotiations, it would perhaps be wise to start creating a solid basis for the negotiations that need to take place anyway, concerning the period following the end of the adjustment period at an early stage. So in order to provide as much legal certainty as possible to those who are affected by the total allowable catches and as well as the access. Now, would it be possible to change the distribution of quotas? Yes, but once again, that would need to be done politically by amending the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. I think that would be my answers to the questions as far as I can answer them. So, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Preuss. Ms. Bartelings or Ms. Smets-Christoph, one of you wants to address the trade issue questions.
I heard one question from Ms. O'Sullivan about the impact of fish processing in the UK. And what you indeed see in the whole discussion about the Brexit, it has focused a lot on wild fish and fish access. But there are more negative impacts in aquaculture and fish processing. And so far that has been a bit, there has not been a lot of focus on this. And while you see in the UK that wild fish indeed gets a positive impact because they can fish more, the UK most definitely has also a negative impact. So the fish processing is hurt by all the trade barriers in both the EU and the UK. And the fish processing is also quite old in the UK. So there's also some questions whether so there's more fish coming from the UK fishers, but if they cannot process this all. And our model gives a prediction on how this will turn out in 2025. And of course, when we are there, so we really have to check what the actual impact was. Our model predictions are mostly so there is some positive impact on the wild fish, but on the fish processing and aquaculture, it's negative for both the EU and the UK.
Merci.
Thank you. So I would suggest sometimes my memory isn't quite what it used to be. Mr. Gaillard, you have the floor to address the questions put to you.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. To answer Madame Rose, generally speaking, if we look at France and the authorizations or licenses allowing them to work in the UK's EEZ, those licenses were delivered quite quickly. Outside of the 12 nautical miles. So I don't think Brexit immediately impacted that fleet. However, the fishing conditions did change because the UK is a coastal state. It therefore enjoys sovereignty over technical measures. It can establish technical measures. These technical measures set by the UK can affect access to its waters. Those fleets which are most affected by Brexit are coastal fleets, under 12 meters. And of course, it depends on the region. The northern French fleets from places like Dunkirk were heavily affected because you're basically right up by the UK. And other fleets were covered by previous measures. So if we look at Normandy, 25% of captures of the Normandy and Brittany fleet are done in UK waters. So 25% for Normandy, 15% for Brittany. So as I say, it really depends on the fishing region, and it really depends on the fishing fleet that we're talking about. We haven't heard about any particular mechanism. It's true that coastal fishing fleets often fish species that are not under quota, so they wouldn't be as affected by changes to quotas under the TCA. It doesn't mean they enjoy unfettered access. So these non-quota species and the management of the non-quota species is on the agenda of the specialized committee. However, as things currently stand, stability for non-quota species is expected. So 44,000 tonnes is the exact figure, if I'm not wrong. On the UK side, there is a request to ensure that non-quota species are managed in a more specific manner. This would take into account the sensitive nature of specific species such as cuttlefish, squid, etc. You spoke about the state of stocks, and you're quite right. The better the stocks are, the higher the tax can be. And if the condition of the stocks is better, the TCA will have a lesser impact. So we saw in 2020 and 2021 some stocks improved. That meant quotas or tax could go up. That meant that the quota decreases or quota swaps didn't matter as much. Unfortunately, the connection has been lost.
Vous avez perdu, Monsieur Caillard.
We've lost you, Mr. Gaillard. You haven't got the best connection from your native Brest. Try again.
Vous m'avez perdu.
On vous a...
We lost you, but now you're back. When did I cut off? 15 or 30 seconds ago. All right, thank you, Chair. So the reverse is true. There's the flip side. If stocks worsen and you have to restrict the TAC to improve the stock, in that case, quota swaps or quota decreases really have an impact. So basically speaking, the better shape a stock is in, the less impact quota swaps or quota decreases have. Then there was a question that was asked about the Brexit adjustment reserve. I think it's worth pointing out that the regulation, the final regulation, was adopted not so long ago. It was adopted by the EU back in October of last year. France and Germany almost preempted the adoption of the regulation with the proposals that they had sent in to the Commission in December. So, by getting ahead of the financial regulation, Germany and France were able to put measures in place pretty quickly. And they did that due to the urgency of the situation, because the impact of the TCA was already being felt by their respective fleets. So that meant that there was a real need. The fleets were in need, and the fleets had almost come to a halt because they were awaiting the final decisions on quotas and tax. So even in June 2021, it wasn't clear what tax and quotas would be. Things did improve, and the 2020 quotas were established. 2022 quotas were established. But things were really urgent at the beginning of 2021, and there needed to be these compensatory schemes. So France and Germany were ahead of the adoption of the regulation with their schemes. And perhaps their mechanisms were more complex than the EMFF. Because if we look at what's allowed under the bar schemes have to be compatible with state aid. So bar money, bar schemes must be in line with the Commission's rules on state aid. So that criterion perhaps adds another layer of complexity for some member states. Just let me look at my notes here for 1 second. There was one member state, Denmark, which was preparing and implementing a scheme that would implement measures under the bar, but the Danish scheme was seen as incompatible with the state aid rules, so they had to go back to the drawing board. So perhaps that explains why member states haven't been so enthusiastic about implementing the money available under the bar. As I was saying, there was a need to have measures already in 2021 because at that point in time the impact was already being felt. But perhaps in between now and then things have changed a bit. But I think what you've said is quite relevant, Chair. Is it right to soften the blow of Brexit with the European Maritime and Fisheries Fund? Why use the EMFF when there's a specific reserve to help deal with the blow of Brexit? So that's a relevant question that's being asked. Thank you very much to the ladies and gentlemen who gave their presentations. We have some time, so Caroline, over to you. I have a question, Mr. Preuls. If water access is renegotiated every year, would that just be the 6 to 12 nautical miles, or would it be the exclusive economic zones? Because there is a risk of change, because a European fishing fleet may fish in European and British waters. Imagine that then they no longer have access, this fleet no longer has access to British waters. This vessel will now fish completely and entirely in European waters. That will lead to great pressure on European ecosystems, wouldn't it? Are there any other questions? Who would like to respond? Raise your hand if you want to respond. Mr. Kaya, Mr. Preuls. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Once again, thanks, Ms. Roos, for your question. It also refers to the EEZ. So the entire system is based that what happens after 30th of June 2026 ought to be based on annual consultations. So as I try to highlight, as it stands for now under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, there is no guarantee that access is in fact fully granted. Such does not exist under the system which has been negotiated under this kind of extreme political pressure 2 years ago. There is the possibility for a very specific period of time, namely from 1st of July 2026 to 31st of December 2026, to take proportional compensatory measures, but this is a 6-month period. So obviously not a mechanism which is eligible to provide for the necessary stability. And what you say is correct. Of course, this can have strong impacts on the sustainability of the stocks. Now, maybe one thing which I would like to re-emphasize, even for the period following the end of the adjustment period, very general principles, in particular the duty to negotiate, to consult in good faith, apply. So it will not be possible to just use pretexts or to refuse to negotiate and consult. That will be a violation of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. But there's not much more I unfortunately have to say that can be done more in this respect. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Preuls. Est-ce que Monsieur Caillard...
Mr. Caillard, would you want to say a few words? Or Ms. Bartlings, but you don't have to.
Ce que je propose quand même, c'est sur nos trois intervenants. Est-ce que vous...
Just to ask whether our three guest speakers would like to say a word or two by way of conclusion. I'll give you the floor in order of earlier. So Mr. Prols first.
Thank you once again, Mr. Chairman. Well, I think what I intended on behalf of the two of us to present, I try to highlight, and this is really what I find is particularly important, is this idea of attempting to implement the trade and cooperation agreement in a spirit of partnership, as long as that's possible. Now, we all know that fisheries issues can be highly politicized, and this is obviously something which happened in the years, or rather in the time following Brexit. But the agreement with which both parties, until further notice, have to live depends on such good faith cooperation. So I would really like to re-emphasize this. This is something which I believe has also been expressed in the draft resolution of the European Parliament, which was recently suggested. So I think that is indeed the right way. And as stated before, it may indeed make sense to try to come up with more stable agreements concerning the period following the end of the adjustment period. And with that, let me once again, also on behalf of my colleague, Dr. Valentin Schatz, thank you very, very much for your attention and for the possibility to present today.
Thank you. Mrs. Bartlings.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity. So what's we mainly wanted to emphasize with our study is also the importance of the trade barriers and the extra trade costs that have now occurred with the trade of fish products. And these trade costs do have an impact, and it should be looked at whether there are some non-tariff trade measures that can be reduced. So remove unnecessary trade barriers between the UK and the EU will benefit both countries. And also don't forget, there has been a lot of attention to wild fisheries and the impact of reduced access, which is of course very important, but don't forget the other impacts. So the trade impacts will cost the sectors, and also the other fish sectors as agriculture and fish processing will cost these sectors also quite a bit of money. And this is something that needs to be kept in mind. And I would also like to thank you for the time and for listening to our presentation and giving us the opportunity to present our results of our study.
Merci, Madame Bartlings. Monsieur...
Thank you, Ms. Bartlings. Mr. Caillard.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. One of my main conclusions, and one of the main conclusions that emerges from the study, is that quota transfers are important. But what is perhaps even more important are the access conditions and the authorizations needed in order to make the most of a quota. There are various sticking points or areas where we should be vigilant. We should be vigilant about the technical measures which could be implemented in the British EEZ, the size of nets or restrictions on fishing gear. Those kind of technical measures could have a real impact on how vessels make the most of their fishing opportunities. Then there's the 12,000 issue, which has been in the headlines since the beginning of the year. That hasn't been resolved yet. There's the issue of proving your past record, proving your past activity. Then there's this issue of replacement vehicles. What will the rules be? What if a ship owner decides to change vessel because his vessel has become obsolete? How would the ship owner still manage to keep his record, his previous track record, and which he needs? He needs to prove that seniority for the 6 to 12 nautical miles issue, and in order to fish around the Channel Islands. So that issue is already causing a bit of a headache for some of the Brune-sur-Mer fleets. I'd also remind you that under the TCA, there is currently no possibility for replacement vehicles to work in the waters around Guernsey and Jersey. So that needs to be on the agenda of the specialised committee in the years to come. So there needs to be a lot of focus on the access conditions which need to be fulfilled to make the most of fishing opportunities. That's my first comment. Then we've heard from the professionals when we were drawing up our study that there has been a relocation of governance. So we're seeing a move towards centralisation of governance within the European capitals. But previously this was done by the actors on the ground. So there's this shift in governance. This shift in governance means that professional representatives don't know how they can be involved in decision making and consultation between the EU and the UK. So there are currently consultation mechanisms, the consultative or advisory councils managed by the Commission for European vessels in European waters. However, as regards discussions between the UK and the EU, as things currently stand, the way in which professional representatives can take part in consultation remains to be determined. So these are the two main comments that I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Caillard.
Thank you, Mr. Caillard. Again, does anyone else want to take the floor? No? Well, I'd like to thank you all and all those who've carried out the study for all these elements which have allowed us to clarify our work. Now, these were all, it's been our preferred subject for months. We wanted to, this is show that we haven't finished yet, and while we are attentive on the conditions for application of applying these agreements, we have to be very vigilant. We've discussed the agreement as it was, but there's a lot of destabilization for economic questions, social questions, even environmental. So really, we really must be vigilant. Now, I'd like to thank you. So before I let you go, because we're going to have a break before we discuss Senegal, I'll give you the results of the vote. Final vote, the initiative report, Isabelle Camellia, Blue Economy, that was adapted, 3-4, 2 against, 4 abstentions. Gabriel Maton, taxing, was adopted, 23-4, 5 against, 0 abstentions. And then the President's opinion on Indo-Pacific strategy, 24-4, 4 abstentions. I'll close the session and then I'll tell you later at 5, same place.